the interview with the Al-Asna founder-in-chief and also the founder-in-chief of MuslimSkeptic.com, Daniel Haqiqatjou.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم نحمده ونصلي على رسوله الكريم أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. This is Under the Radar, Radio Islam International, and once again very fortunate to have a visiting scholar in South Africa, Ustad Daniel Haqiqatjou, who is the founder of the Al-Asna Institute, and here to share some of his ideas and I think some very critical discussions that for a long while have been happening online. We're fortunate today to be having it on air and in person as well. Ustad Daniel, thank you so much for your time, and assalamu alaikum.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalam ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum, jazakallah khair for having me. I'm very happy to be speaking to you.
Your visit to South Africa, just as a bit of an introduction, you've been here for a few days, I don't think much longer. The purpose of your visit and some reflections on the interactions you've had so far?
Alhamdulillah, it's a beautiful country with a beautiful Muslim community, and everyone has been extremely nice and friendly, and mashallah, the community here has many strengths in South Africa, and my job, my purpose here was just to speak about some of the things that I've studied, some of the ideas that I've studied that I think are very relevant to the Muslim community. So I've had an opportunity to speak at different masajid, different schools, and also different madrasas, and alhamdulillah, everyone has been very receptive.
I think for people to be able to appreciate what we speak about in, as the interview progresses, the kind of ideas about secularism and feminism, and many other topics that you've been quite vocal about, maybe we need to appreciate your own personal story and your journey in terms of the evolution, I guess, of your thought or your experiences, studying, in a secular setting, being at Harvard, and thereafter those impressions or the impact that has had. Just give us your story in a nutshell in that sense.
Yes, I was raised as a secular Muslim by parents who were more secular from Iran. And I always felt I was a Muslim, but I always had these conceptions that Islam was compatible with feminism, Islam was compatible with democracy and secularism. And this is the common conception that most Muslims today might have, especially in the West. They don't think twice that maybe there's a contradiction between these ideologies. The reality is there are deep contradictions, and the more that you study Islam, read the Quran, read Hadith, it's very clear that Islam could not be described as a feminist. Islam could not be described as secular or liberal or Marxist, for example. So this is a realization that I came to. For a lot of Muslims, unfortunately, it causes a crisis of faith for young Muslims in the West when they come to this realization as they learn more about the deen. So for me, alhamdulillah, it wasn't a crisis of faith. I had the opportunity to study. I thought that, look, these are ideologies that conflict with Islam. That doesn't mean that there's a problem with Islam. That doesn't mean there's a problem with the Quran and Sunnah. There's a problem with these ideologies. And so I studied them at Harvard and did research in my graduate program, my postgraduate programs. And alhamdulillah, it's very clear that these ideologies are very easy to refute, to undermine. They're incoherent, they're self-contradictory. And alhamdulillah, that personally for me helped my confidence and conviction, yaqeen in Islam when you clear away these ideologies and realize that Islam has no need for them.
Talk to me about the formal ways that you are now advancing these ideas, educating more people about them. I mean, you've got the website Muslim Skeptic. Also, I mentioned the Al-Asna Institute, the idea behind this.
Yeah, so when I was in graduate school, postgraduate school in the U.S., my intention was to teach against these ideologies as an academic. But it became very clear that the university system in the West is not a free market of open ideas as they claim. And if you're not going to teach or orient yourself towards a certain ideology, you're not going to be allowed to progress. You're not going to be recommended. You're not going to get through your classes. You're not going to be able to get a professorship. So this is a problem I realized. I had to go into the corporate world. I was working as a product manager for many years in software and IT. And I realized that I can still teach and speak about and write about these ideologies and share that knowledge with the rest of the Muslim community. And so I did that. I started writing online, and that eventually became what is now skeptic.com, and it's skeptic with a K. And alhamdulillah, that has garnered attention. People are reading it, alhamdulillah. And then also Al-Asna Institute. It's a more formal curriculum that I teach online, and students enroll, they subscribe to the institute, and they take courses at their own pace on these issues, where I, as a teacher, as well as my wife, Khalid, she's a co-instructor, we teach on these ideologies in a step-by-step, organized way, and then you take the courses, and at the end, you're able to achieve a certificate once you've completed the entire curriculum.
Daniel, let me ask you to break down words that sometimes we use very liberally, but perhaps there's a meaning that we don't understand, or to be able to advance this discussion, I think we just need to define these properly. So you talk about liberalism, you talk about secularism, you talk about feminism. Just in a nutshell, for dummies, if you'd like, what do those terms mean? You could perhaps add a few others that are essential to this discussion.
Sure. We can have a nice little breakdown in a few minutes, summarize all of these things. But the main umbrella ideology is modernism. Modernism, which began in the 1500s within Europe, Britain, France, Germany, and they left religion, they left Christianity. They felt that it was superstitious, irrational. We have to be rational thinkers and progress and advance. And this is the modernist idea, that the human civilization is constantly progressing, advancing, getting more rational, getting more moral. This is the main ideology that began in Europe. And as you can see, this is completely contrary to Islam, because in Islam, the past contains the rationality and the morality. The Prophet ﷺ lived in the past. The Salaf were in the past. The Quran was revealed in the past. All of these things are the past, so we're not going to progress beyond them. We're not going to know more than what the ulama knew in the past. And this is a very contentious issue in the modern world with Muslims who are affected by this modernist, progressivist ideology. Within modernism, you have liberalism. Within modernism, you have liberalism. And liberalism is the ideology that the only morality that we can have is a morality that aims to constantly increase human liberty, human freedom, human equality. So this is what liberalism is. And then feminism is a subfield of liberalism. Secularism is a subfield of liberalism. Marxism, communism, socialism, capitalism, even fascism, all of these have that same objective, maximize human liberty, maximize human happiness. And when they say happiness, they mean a very specific thing. They don't mean the kind of happiness that Muslims experience with the sweetness of Iman, the happiness that comes from being good. They're talking about the happiness in terms of bodily pleasures, material pleasures. This is all that happiness can mean, because they've rejected God. So in a nutshell, that is what liberalism is, and this is something that we can easily analyze and refute from a conceptual as well as historical basis.
Where does this begin to loom large over Muslim consciousness and become an issue that Muslims have to tackle and interact with, historically speaking? Do these contradictions and do Muslims come face to face with these ideas perhaps much more with the onset of the 21st century, or does it come with the fall of the Khilafah? And, Muslims are now struggling to chart the way between different causes and don't really have some sort of overall guidance in this regard?
These issues became very important for Muslims because of colonization, and colonization happened at the beginning of the 19th century with Britain, France, and the Dutch attacking Muslims in North Africa, in Egypt, in the subcontinent, as well as Southeast Asia and Indonesia. So this is the tool that was used by the colonizer to attack Islam was modernism, was liberalism. These ideas were in large part formulated, designed, engineered to attack Muslims and Islam. This was a point in history where the West was ascendant from the Dunyawi political sense. They were advancing technologically and developing weapons that they're using against the entire world. And so Muslims were one of the main victims, but at that time Muslims were the other superpower. And so with two superpowers, the West was formulating an ideology to undermine Islam on an intellectual and moral level and weaken Muslims intellectually by this ideology. So it's ironic that now, post-colonization, in the past 200 years, some Muslims have adopted exactly the ideology of the enemy. They have adopted exactly the underlying assumptions and the values coming from an ideology that was used to attack and to undermine Islam.
Let's fast forward, Daniel, to some of the hot topic or hot button issues of the day. And one of them being the issue of sexual preference and, the LGBT community. I'm curious in this regard to know where exactly or when exactly did this, or how did it become a barometer for questioning whether people are on this side of the fence, this side of the fence, their allegiance to a liberal or liberal values. How did this become kind of such a serious differentiating issue?
This is the nature of progressivism and modernism, that they striving to constantly discover, quote unquote, discover new values and new practices and new freedoms that must be respected by all. So this is the nature of it. They're constantly going to tear down the prior moral order and invent and build up a new moral order of their choosing. And, just to keep it brief, think about fashion. One of the things about fashion that has been claimed is that the elite within a society are constantly trying to distinguish themselves from the poor and from the lower classes. And so they will wear and dress in accordance to a particular fashion. But then that becomes fashionable, and then the lower classes and the poor start dressing in those same ways with those same fashions. And that distinction between the elite and the lower classes and then the law is lost because everyone wears the same thing. And so the elite then have to change to maintain their distinction, to maintain that kind of status through their clothes. They change and they update their fashions. And it can also be argued that this is a way that the West maintains a kind of moral superiority over other nations. They constantly are adopting new freedoms that everyone must respect, they claim, and this distinguishes them as the pinnacle of morality across the world, and then they can demand that all countries catch up to them and accept exactly what they have accepted. And if those countries, those nations, those people do not adapt, do not accept those values, then that becomes a justification for the West to attack, to oppress, to subjugate through international law. You are not respecting human rights. You are not respecting human freedom. And this is how they morally justify themselves and maintain a kind of moral power over the rest of the world.
So when we talk the language of, humanity, people say we are human beings before we are a member of a particular faith, or the language of human rights. Does that originate from liberalism, as you speak, and that in itself, by just using those kind of terminologies, you're already buying into a paradigm subconsciously?
Yes, of course. Human rights discourse is coming directly from liberalism. And the question is, where does the definition of humanity come from? Who gets to define what a human being even is? And if we are able to take one particular definition originating from the beliefs and the assumptions of one culture, the modernist culture, the modernist paradigm, if that is being imposed on others, everyone has to accept that definition of humanity and the human rights entailed by that. But we reject it. Why should we accept whatever is defined by modernists, atheists, liberals, when they say, for example, that for a person truly to be free, they should have the choice and the agency to engage in whatever sexual desires, any desire that you have, you must fulfill that no matter what. And if you do not fulfill that, that means you are repressed. And this is harmful for the human being. Where did this come from? As you can see, this is completely contradictory to Islam. No, as Muslims, we know, because how do we know? Because the creator of human beings has informed us and told us and commanded us that if you engage in many of these lusts and many of these shahawat, it'll actually lead to your destruction. In fact, you will be destroyed. You will destroy not only yourself, you'll destroy your family, you'll destroy your community and society and civilization as a whole. The Creator has informed us of this. So why should we replace that conception of humanity with what is on offer from the modern West? It would be completely irrational for us to do so on so many levels.
The arena wherein many of these ideas are introduced to impressionable Muslim minds seems to obviously be through educational institutions, through curricula, but also through engagement in social justice struggles. Now, that's a value that Muslims obviously, put a lot of weight on, achieving justice, fighting for the downtrodden, etc. But how do, young Muslims strike that balance to ensure that, yes, we are out there raising our voices against the injustices of the day, but are not swept away by another undercurrent?
There are many issues of injustice, many examples of injustice and oppression in the world today. We have to be very careful about adopting an ideology that may have certain semblances or agreement with Islam in some ways, but in other ways is deeply antithetical to Islam. And this is one of the tricks of shaitan. This is one of the great dangers, that you have something that is true, but it is mixed with a great deal of falsehood. And those kinds of mixtures are even more dangerous, because Muslims think that they're following something that is good and in line with Islam, when in fact it is poisoning them and their understanding of Islam. So this is the case with social justice, the social justice movement as a whole. We have to be very careful not to get into the kinds of alliances that will compromise our faith, compromise our values, compromise our principles. We often hear that, Muslims and LGBT, we have shared values, we are both minorities, quote unquote, and we have to work together against the powers that be. No, we should never accept this kind of formulation. In fact, those who are promoting LGBT are among the greatest of oppressors. They're among the greatest of Zalimin, because they're oppressing human beings in promoting fahisha and promoting this kind of behavior. So the very idea that Muslims should ally with tyrants in opposed to tyranny is completely irrational and incoherent. So we have to be very aware of this. Could there be other groups that we work with, or that we have a similar message against injustice? Yes, that is possible. It's a case-by-case basis. But we have to be principled. We have to get rid of this inferiority complex that if we don't have others to work with, then that means we are weak. We cannot accomplish that. No, Allah has created or has distinguished Muslims and this ummah as the best example for mankind, because we command the good and we forbid the evil, and we believe in Allah. So we don't necessarily need people to be aligned with. We have to be the flag bearers, and then others will see that and will join us and will support us. But we lead the way. We are going to be helped by Allah against all kinds of injustice as defined by Islam, not as defined by some other ideology.
On the issue of sexual abuse in the community, obviously a big issue in South Africa every year. For instance, we have days of activism against women and child abuse, and it's a serious chronic problem in society. Attacks of men on their spouses and their partners, etc. At the same time, we've seen movements like Me Too and phrases like men are thresh and so forth. Again, the question I'm putting to you is striking of the balance. How do we confront genuine issues of abuse of partners and gender-based abuse, whilst not being again swept away or sucked into an ideology or ideological constructs that are being pushed through these kind of movements?
Well, the very claim that we are, quote unquote, suffering from this problem and this is a widespread problem, even accepting that is to accept an ideological position. We should not accept this claim that is being made from outside against our community that we have a problem, and therefore we have to accept the intervention of other kinds of ideologies, the intervention of other kinds of professionals within our community, because this is exactly what they want to do. They want to control the community. They want to dictate to the community. They want to dictate values that we have to accept. An example is this curriculum of sexual education for young children as young as 7. And they try to justify this by saying that, there's so much abuse in your community, therefore we need to educate your children on sexual matters. In reality, they want to, this is not sexual education, this is zina education. They want to sexualize children as young as 7 with these kinds of beliefs and ideologies coming from their worldview and their philosophies. So it's a very clear program. Yes, it is possible that there is abuse that happens in isolated individual cases, but to claim that this is a systematic issue that needs to create an overhaul of our community, we have to completely reject this and not buy into that narrative. In fact, Muslims have been at the forefront of stopping abuse against women and children. All of our standards within Islam in terms of gender relations and interaction, the prevention of khalwa, the prevention of zina, modesty, hijab, parda, all of these concepts put us far, far ahead of others in terms of stopping abuse and stopping the kind of sexual harassment that is found in the West. And the ugly face of this kind of abuse has been revealed because of the Me Too movement. And now they have the audacity to say that we are going to educate you Muslims and we're going to dictate to you Muslims these issues of sexual propriety and preventing abuse. We should laugh in their face at their audacity to say such a thing. We reject these kinds of ideological pushes from the kuffar against Muslims, and simple reflection shows how ludicrous the situation has become.
Daniel, I haven't been too coherent in my line of questioning because of time, but just two final questions very briefly. You spoke a bit earlier on about the LGBT movement. I mean, just in a context like South Africa, but I would imagine any liberal democracy around the world, very often the specter is raised of hate speech when these kind of topics are discussed. Furthermore, people would say that the same constitution, for instance, in South Africa that affords us rights as a Muslim minority, affords us freedom of religion, affords the other communities similar rights. So sticking our head out to talking about it is, putting us as much as a disadvantage as them, if you have to tackle it head on.
That I don't even understand how that makes sense. On every single level, that is nonsense. First of all, religious freedom, we don't have time to get into the details, but as I argue in my classes and the various essays that I've written, religious freedom itself is an incoherent concept. What we find, in fact, is that Muslims are greatly restricted in terms of what of their religion they can practice within any of these secular countries. And the secular countries are not neutral with respect to their laws. In fact, their laws are based on the religion of modernism. That is the religion that is established by the state, and anything that contradicts modernism and liberalism is highly curtailed from other faith groups, in particular Muslims. So there is absolutely no real substantive example of religious freedom, and in fact the concept as a whole is incoherent. As far as this LGBT minority and minorities are supposed to collaborate with each other, no, let's not belittle ourselves by equating ourselves with this group. How are they a minority? First of all, they're not a religion, they're not an ethnicity, they're not a race. It's just a group of people who have a particular sexual predilection. They have a sexual predilection in wanting to, not to get explicit, but to put something into something else. This is a community. This is a minority that we have to work with. That's laughable. We shouldn't accept these terms and these kinds of values that are being imposed on us. So no, we have nothing to gain by the LGBT groups gaining the right to marriage or the right to force children to learn about them and appreciate them within schools. In fact, as more of these LGBT privileges are accepted by society, the more Muslims have to compromise of their faith. In some countries in the West, imams no longer even talk about Qawm Lut. Some imams no longer teach the ayat about Qawm Lut because they're afraid of hate speech restrictions penalizing them and even putting them in prison because they're speaking against this fahisha. So show me, prove to me how there's any kind of shared values or shared goals that we have with these LGBT people. There is none, really. The more that those values are accepted, the worse it is for Muslims. So those who are claiming that Muslims have to collaborate, cooperate, support, endorse these values are the enemies of the Muslim community, and we should very strongly reject their claims and not allow them to distort and distract the community on this issue.
Lastly, would you say it is inferiority, the root of all of this, and the way Muslim thought has gravitated in this direction, the alliances that our people are making, all goes down to an issue of inferiority? And what is the best antidote, in your opinion, to inferiority and building a new proud generation of Muslims?
Absolutely, it's all inferiority, and Muslims need to let me just go back. Yes, there's absolutely inferiority. Those Muslims, it's a minority who have this sense of inferiority, need to rediscover that Islam is the peak of rationality, the peak of morality. They need to have this kind of conviction, and so that they can join the rest of the ummah, the rest of the Muslims in the world, and the ulama and the leaders who are going to lead us to victory in every domain. And we have this glorious history, and we have the example of the Prophet ﷺ, we have the example of the Sahaba, and their success was because of how much they were committed to Islam and how clearly they saw the truth of Islam. Insofar as we are not at their level, it is because we are not at their level in conviction. Once we are able to achieve that, inshallah, with the help of Allah, then you can see how much Muslims will, inshallah, accomplish in the future.
Daniel, thank you so much for your time. Lovely interacting with me. Look forward to hearing and learning from you much more in the future.